Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm delighted to welcome you all to INSEAD's lifelong learning webinar entitled Peace and Conflict Management for a Contentious World, which, as most of you would agree, is extremely timely given the complex negotiations currently taking place on the global stage. My name is Sadia Khan, and I attended INSEAD in 1995, so hope to celebrate my 30th reunion with my cohort this summer. I also came back to INSEAD for the International Directors Program in 2016 and have been actively involved with the alumni network ever since graduation. On to the main event. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Professor Horacio Falcão, who, as you know, is INSEAD's Professor of Management Practice, where he teaches and researches on negotiation sciences. He also directs INSEAD's Executive Education Negotiation Dynamics Program and co-created the two new INSEAD Negotiation Certificate programs, Online Certificate in Negotiation and Advanced Certificate in Negotiation. He is also the founding partner of two companies, Value Negotiations, an advisory company to support organizations in their complex negotiations, and VN Tech, a negotiation support startup. In 2010, Horacio published his book, Value Negotiations, How to Finally Get the Win-Win Right. A lawyer trained in both civil and common law systems, Horacio graduated as an LLM from Harvard Law School with a concentration on alternative dispute resolution in 1997. He has an MBA in 2002 and an executive master's in organizational psychology in 2010 from INSEAD. In 2019, he earned his PhD at Singapore Management University. So without much further ado, it's over to you, Professor Horacio.
Thank you, Sadia. It's a real pleasure to be introduced by someone as distinguished as you. Thank you so much for agreeing to do that. So thanks for coming to this webinar, and thanks for being a part of this conversation about peace and conflict in or for a contentious world, or in a contentious world that we are right now. What I would like to do is I would like to cover a bit where we are and some of the ideas that might be pushing us into this feeling that we are in a worse moment than a few years ago. And then talk about some generic building blocks of what could you look for later when you're trying to expand your knowledge about peace and conflict management. I'll give you some definitions, some building blocks, some core ideas. We're going to try to keep it somewhat short to give enough time for a debate and for your questions and answers. The idea is that today is not a course on skill building. So normally that's what I will help people in my MBAs or executive education courses. I will spend time people learning what to say, when to say exactly, what is the right strategy. Here's a little bit more of a big picture idea so that we become a little bit more comfortable with the field as such, and so that everyone can pursue a little bit more on their own later if they're interested. I'll be more than glad to also make the slides available at the end. And there's a big reference, a bibliography that you can also pursue if you want to learn a little bit more about any of the specifics. So without further ado, let me actually open up the slides and let me start introducing some of the ideas that I prepared for you today. So peace and conflict management in or for a contentious world, right? Because we're in, but it's also to improve and try to help the contentious world we're in. So where do I want to get started? The idea is that actually asking the question, are we having more conflict? And it might seem like an obvious question given everything that we're seeing in the media today. And I'm not here yet to say on this slide if it's right or wrong, but some of the things that we're seeing are things like, it seems like we're having more and more bitter conflicts. It seems like things are becoming more violent. We're actually having more armed conflicts between bigger nations than we had in a few years ago. Therefore, more wars. Things seem to be more emotionally charged, not just on wars, even internal conflicts, even within companies, within classrooms, we're seeing things like that. Things are becoming more morally sensitive. Just say one wrong word and suddenly things explode. People become more trigger happy in being aggressive. For example, in the internet, like all the trolling and the bullying we're seeing. Identity-based issues, which are of course very core to anyone, are actually very sensitive, and therefore they do generate stronger reactions. We are now seeing more labels and identities, then that becomes more groupish and things become more polarized, and we could continue listing all the things that we're seeing as trends nowadays that are working into this perception that we're having, that we're just in a much more conflictuous and much less peaceful world than before. Now, the idea is, are we having, maybe, like meaning a lot of things have changed. And some of them I just mentioned on the previous slide. This is just to give you a more detailed list. But for example, I'm not going to read all of them for you. This is again for your reference later, but I'll just mention a couple or a few. So for example, now people are starting to feel more than what we used to, that winning at all costs is okay, that the end justifies the means. Before, if you were to have a political debate, people will still value the freedom of speech. They will still value the process. Nowadays, everyone is blaming each other's process. Everyone is trying to fudge the process because they're just trying to win. And therefore, by letting of the rules of the game to actually focus on the winning of the game, people are starting to create a lot more of an uncivilized, let's call it, approach to conflict, a much more violence-prone approach to conflict, which in a way is a retrocess on what we had not too long ago. Now, again, I don't want to oversell or overblow this out of proportion. I just want to highlight one thing that might be not so obvious for a lot of people. And then there's a lot of things, for example, that are a little older, meaning everyone wants others to change, not themselves, meaning that's why we go to negotiation courses, to convince the other person to do what I want. And one of the things that I try to spend time explaining to people is exactly the opposite, is the idea that no, you want to change the other and yourself together so that you both grow and you both become better, especially when we're talking about conflicts and peace and not just money on the table, but even if it is about the money on the table. Yeah? And then we're starting to see the growth of social media and a different kind of debate, a different kind of discourse in the internet where it uses much fewer words, much less explained, there's much more polarization, much more divisiveness, and all of that suddenly is starting to migrate into the face-to-face discourse. And people are starting to find that some of those behaviors that were in the internet suddenly are also okay in our face-to-face discourse, in our diplomatic negotiations, in our conflict management behaviors. And so there are some things that are dramatically changing vis-a-vis what we used to see just 10 years or 20 years ago, partially also because of technological changes. We're also having a more diverse world. We have more minority rights and people are talking more about DEI. Now, that is actually good. New voices are entering the debate, but more voices that are different actually mean that we're more likely to have conflict no matter what. But it could be good conflict, but it's more conflict anyhow. And more conflict usually means less of a feel of peace. So because of several advances socially and technologically, we are about to see an increase in the number of conflict points, which doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. It's only a bad thing if we don't know how to handle it well. And that's part of what we're trying to discuss here today. And so moving on to the next phase to just answer now a bit more, are we actually having more conflict? And there's this book from Steven Pinker, which has some people are a big fan, some people are not. I'm not here to sell the idea of the book or the book itself, but if you were to kind of see a lot of the graphs, they pretty much all follow the same tendency. This is the y-axis will be a representation of more violence, be it death, be it actually just violence, be it whatever act of aggression that you would imagine. There's several graphs for several different purposes there, but most of them are, is there more violence? And then the other axis here, the x-axis, is about time. Sorry, my pen just stopped working. Oh, no, it didn't. It's just delayed. So the x-axis is about time. And on this one, you can see is 1945 to close to today. Some graphs go down 200, 300, 400, 500 years. But what I'm trying to show through this graph is just an example, is that page after page and graph after graph, what we see is this. Is the fact that conflict has been dramatically reducing, not only in the last 500, but the last 50 years and so forth. And that we're living a time of unprecedented small number of violence or deaths, of wars or the likes. And that while there's still a certain number of people who are suffering a lot, and I'm not trying to diminish the problem on an individual scale, from a global scale, from a bigger scale like a civilization or a planet that we all share, we are seeing relative reduction on the numbers, relative. Sometimes the numbers could be high on an absolute sense, but we're definitely seeing relative. Now, some of you might be paying attention to the graph and say, Horacio, but that's only 2015. I'm starting to feel this anxiety that there's more in the last 10 years or so, which is exactly what this graph is not covering. And one could argue that there is a little bit of an uptick. I haven't seen the data yet, right? But I'm sorry, I didn't look for it. I couldn't find something too reliable. I found a couple of things, but nothing that I felt comfortable showing with you. to you now. And so the idea is that, in my view, there is more deaths when you follow some of the big wars that are happening now. You see Russia, Ukraine, you see Palestine, Gaza, and Israel. You start seeing all of these things, and suddenly you're saying, okay, there seem to be more armed conflict, there seem to be more death. When you start also looking at the political landscape, you start seeing more polarization as well. So we're seeing a lot of those. And so to some extent, from verbal violence to just bullying to actually deaths and war, there seems to be more. Now, how significant it is? Well, if we would see here in the graph, it would be somewhat of the equivalent of an uptick. It wouldn't be something that will go all the way here. So while it's still a negative trend and we should be aware of it and absolutely do something about it, we should not panic just yet. We're in no place of like, oh my God, we're going back 100 years or so. We're not there. We're definitely not there. Okay, so let us move a little bit more. Now, why is that happening? Are we inherently good? Are we inherently evil? Is our evil sides coming back up again for whatever reason? And so you have the philosophers Thomas Hobbes, who believes more in the civilization as a veneer that keeps us under check, the animal inside under check. And then you have Rousseau that believes that people are good. And the research on evolution, psychology, actually even religion, philosophy, they all converging to the same place. We are both, meaning we have the potential to be very good and altruistic, but we also have the potential to be very selfish. It will depend on the context that we are under, our country, our groups, our social connections, and it depends of course, there's some individual responsibility on that as well. Some people will make more choices to go on the side of altruism, so others will go into the side of selfishness. Now, if you think a little bit more about it, we are actually wired to repudiate. Like when we see violence, most of us do not enjoy seeing violence. There's a small percentage, single digits, of people who might be not affected or actually have a little bit of pleasure with it. But these people are deviations of what we see as more than the 90%. We do have the potential, though, more than just single digit, to be savage and cruel. Why? Because while we're wired to not like and appreciate violence, we actually have a very sensitive switch that can actually be turned off on that repudiation of violence, depending on if we are feeling threatened or if we actually project it towards outgroup. And here now, hopefully you're seeing the two elements that tend to flick that switch away from your more altruistic side and push us into the more selfish or cruel side come into play, which is this idea that we're feeling significantly more threatened nowadays with our debates and our extremist views and things of sorts. And we're feeling that they're much more outgroups because we're labeling each other more. And by doing some of that, actually they're more outgroups. And so you will actually feel that your norms to your group do not apply to the outgroups. And that allows us to be much more cruel, savage, and even be very creative about how to do that sometimes. And so when we start looking at that, we start seeing, okay, but why is that happening? What do you mean by more labels? Well, now more and more, we're starting to understand what makes people different on different groups. So this here is a research from a very famous professor, Jonathan Haidt. He wrote a book some time ago about self-righteousness and the like. And he basically talks about moral foundations. And he finds that people who are very liberal in the US, well, let's call it the left wings over there, they have care as the utmost value for them. Whereas if you were to think about the more conservatives, or what they call the Republicans over there, the right wing, they are much more into the liberty and fairness. Now, that difference has existed for generations. And yet, for whatever reason now, it became a much bigger deal. It became a much like, you are all wrong. But notice, they still care a lot about caring. It's not like caring is down here at zero. And these people here, the left side, okay, loyalty, okay, it's not that they don't care about it either. They just care about it less. And so at some point, we're starting to focus so much on our differences, and that those differences will make us even more look like outgroups, that's actually creating more of that sense that it's okay to treat the other wrongly. It's okay to bend the rules. It's okay to do whatever it takes to win. It's actually okay to not even talk to them, because if they're from another group, they're bad people, so let's not even entertain. And so if we go a little deeper on that, right, people are starting to develop a moral matrix to focus more on their differences, more from an intuitive, emotional point of view, not so much on a cognitive appreciation of issues, and much more about loyalty to their groups, And so as you see, none of that is about addressing the real problems and trying to find and build bridges with the other side. It's all about being in my group, being with my emotion, and if my emotion tells me something, then I'm right. But your emotions are different from mine because they come from different moral foundations. And moral foundations will indicate your emotions. And so because we have this inherent human difference on the moral foundations, your moral matrix will push you into an intuitive decision-making in a group that will be different from mine. And so that happened throughout history. What have we done and what are we still doing and what can we continue to do, hopefully better and more, to avoid that? And that is to search the bridges to the common humanity. We are much more alike than we are different, but we tend to focus too much on the differences because it's easy to see, as opposed to focus on that common humanity and making the exercise, the effort, that takes effort and pain sometimes, to sit across the table from the other and be open to listen, be open to learning, be open to being wrong. All of those are extremely difficult things to do, and they require a certain element of emotional maturity. And so when you put all of that together, it's very easy to see how we have been gravitating, and partially because of what I mentioned before, the social, the new social trends, the new technological trends that are changing our debate and pushing us to the upper part of that duality I just shared there, as opposed to the bottom part. And if you start doing that, what happens? The out group becomes the devil, because if everything they say is wrong, that means they're evil. If they don't care about we care the most, the moral foundation we care the most, that means that they don't understand they're not good people, because our morality also indicates what's good and what's bad. And so if they care about something else that should also be good, but is not our priority good, then they are just bad. And so that dichotomy of just calling the other person the devil and making ourselves the angel is also making things very difficult. So I have a couple of quotes here that I'd like to share with you. Yeah. So the first one is, people who do things we see as evil, they rarely think of themselves as such. They usually think of themselves as victims. Victims of the situation, victims of the conflict. Even when people do wrong things, when they do bad things, oftentimes they have a very beautiful rationalized story in their mind of why they had to do it, why they had no choice, and the likes. And we need to help people move away from this kind of narrative and allow them to make mistakes, because we all make mistakes, and see if we can bring everyone together to a place where no one of us is a devil, but none of us is an angel either, because we're not. And that's part of what's happening with this in-group, out-group dimension, right? Here's another quote that I actually like a lot, which is saying, okay, it's not about finding the perfect person. It's actually about creating a process with the right conditions so that we can elicit the cooperative in each other. The moment we recognize that there's this duality in both of us, we know that people have the good and the evil inside, the altruistic and the selfish. Is not about expecting someone to only have the altruistic, because that doesn't happen. It's about embracing the two sides, but creating a society, a relationship, a process, a group, where we elicit more the altruistic and less the selfish, more the cooperative and less the competitive. Again, both should exist, and actually it's important that both exist. Everyone needs to be a little selfish every now and then. Not cruel, but everyone needs to be a little selfish. Everyone needs to care about themselves, so that they can also care about others. So, but we need to know that sometimes that element will create poor behaviors for the group and for others. But we need to embrace that as part of that's who we are. We need to grow and learn how to handle that together. But we will do that if we're talking to one another, educating one another, accepting one another, not necessarily what you do, but accepting the person itself. That's what we call in negotiation literally acceptance, not agreement. I don't need to agree with you, but I need to accept you as another that I can talk to as an equal. And so here's some of the building blocks. Like when we talk about conflict, it's also good to identify, am I having a task conflict? Is it about money? Is it about opinions, about facts? Is it a relationship? We are having a relationship problem. We are behaving poorly with one another, independent of the task. Or is it about my values are clashing with yours, which is usually some of the most intense conflicts we can have. When we look into trying to fix things, we need to remember that we need to fix them at several levels. We need to fix them on the outcome. Are we allocating value or the solution in ways that both feels like they're getting enough of what they want? Are we treating each other, procedurally speaking, in a way that makes everyone feel like they were an active part of solving the conflict, and they were not just a victim of an imposed decision by someone else? And then when they are acting with me, am I treating them with respect? That's the interpersonal that you read down there in the slide. or the informational? Am I giving them enough information so they can participate actively and make a good decision for themselves? So when we're looking at the problem and the solution, we need to understand a little bit more the complexity and the nuances of each of those, so that when we bring ourselves in as conflict managers in a group, we need to be able to do both. Understand the problem well on its different dimensions, and understand what are the different ways that I need to solve this. And if we look at a little bit more on what are some of the institutional elements of value of conflict management and peace building, we have four main pillars, let's say, right? And that comes from a field of alternative dispute resolution. On the very right of the slide, you have litigation, go to court. But in the last 30, 40 years, there's a big movement on the other three: negotiation, mediation, arbitration. And very quickly there, I gave you a line of what are the differences between them. So from negotiation to mediation, now you have a third party trying to help you. Negotiation is you and the other person, or many. On the mediation, you have someone who is neutral, doesn't necessarily care about which outcome you have. They just care that you get one if you can. They might try to help you just with the process. They might try to give recommendations of outcomes, but they don't decide for you, which is actually what happens in the arbitration, which is a little bit more of a private court system. You go there, you make a case. In an arbitration, who's supposed to be neutral as well, but it's kind of paid by the parties, makes a decision much like a judge would. And of course, what's the difference between arbitration and litigation? Arbitration is private, you pay for it, you make it happen, whatever decision comes out, whatever happens there, stays there. If you go to court, it might go to the media, right? People can access your decision or your case, and they can actually have a lot of understanding of what was going on, which is important for some cases in society when you try to set precedents or send messages to the group. So what am I sharing this with you is because a lot of the conflict management will actually navigate between these three or among these four pillars, but there are a lot of what? There are a lot of hybrid systems between those as well, which I'm not going to spend too much time here talking about because it's not for the scope of today, right? So I drew there little lines there for you to see that there are hybrid systems that play from elements of the different to make something more tailored specific for your conflict. So if you're a little bit more engaged in going deeper into conflict management or peace building, those are some of the things that you will probably want to look into to see what's already available as process that has proven to be effective for particular kinds of conflicts. So there's the movement of ADR, alternative dispute resolution. There's another way of looking into it, which is called adequate dispute resolution. The A now not standing for alternative, but adequate. And the idea now more and more is that we're moving towards that. Different conflicts require different ways of addressing them. So just having a hammer and going around everything will not work anymore for conflicts as they may have used 50 or 100 years ago. What is another thing that we need to start creating? We need to start creating the idea that a safe space is not enough, because a safe space is where we actually make people feel safe, but that also means that we don't speak what sometimes need to be spoken. And so there's a good friend of mine, Professor Dan Shapiro from Harvard. He wrote a fantastic book, Negotiating the Non-Negotiable, where he introduces the concept of the brave space, where we show ourselves truly, fully. We talk what we need to talk, but we do that with care. We do that by trying to be careful with others, with the spirit of creating understanding and helping each other grow. But we do talk whatever is on our mind, as careful and as proper as we can, so that the other person has an easier time to listen to us as well. So we become responsible not only for the sharing, but for facilitating the receiving of the message. And that's the brave space. But it's brave because you need to be ready to hear some things that you would prefer not to hear otherwise. And so I've been trying to push this in my class, and I've been seeing great results with the students, appreciating the environment where they can actually learn the truth and grow as a group, as opposed to try to avoid topics with the fear that others will be too fragile and therefore underestimating the strength of a human being. We're almost done here. I just want to share a few more things we do. Another thing is the idea that conflict should now not be something that you're surprised with. When you pick up your car, your taxi, your bus, and you go to work, if there's a red light, you don't go, oh my God, I didn't see that one coming. Meaning it's annoying, you don't want to stop. You would prefer to keep going in a green light. But you don't have it every now and then because other people need to also cross the street. And so conflict is the same. Every now and then you try to push something forward. Someone is trying to push in a different direction. That's the crossing of the roads. There's a red light for you. You just need to stop and deal with it. Or you just need to be patient sometimes. Or more likely than not, in this case, the metaphor is not 100% fitting. You just invite the other person for a conversation, understanding that that's part of your journey to get where you want. So if the moment you start normalizing that idea, hopefully the easier it will become for you to prepare and get it done well. So let me, now, what is peace then? Peace is not the absence of conflict. We'll always have conflict because we have this dual nature. It will never go away. We have different values. We will always disagree. But disagreement doesn't mean lack of peace. It's how we handle the disagreement that means lack of peace. I disagree with my wife and my kids every day. We don't have to fight over it, and we definitely don't get violent or aggressive because we've learned to treat each other in process that we learn the ability to handle conflicts well. And so that's what we would like to invite you to do. Instead of looking at win-lose as a way to negotiate, look at more as a win-win. Look at the 7 elements to give you the more nuanced approach to understanding that there's so many different tools for you to go about it. I'm not going to explain this in detail. I actually teach my whole MBA course just on that. So it's an extremely rich framework, but I wanted to introduce to you in case you would like to pursue further. That's called the 7 Elements Framework. You can probably find it in the internet. And if you want to know more, of course, you can reach out or just dig wherever the internet takes you. The other thing that I wanted to share with you is, okay, so why is then conflict so difficult? Well, it does get us emotional. It actually also makes it hard for us to diagnose what's going on because we don't have the tools. We tend to be triggered and then react or respond in kind. If people punch me, I'll punch them back. And we're not very skilled. We're not very trained. And one of the things that we should do is we should start becoming a bit more trained in conflict management. And I appreciate the fact that you're here today because that shows that you're trying to understand more about that topic. And so the ways that people tend to respond to conflict can be varied. They can be more competitive. You say something, hey, I think there's a problem. They go, no, it's your fault. So they're more here on the contending or competing side. Or people say, I think there's a problem. Yeah, let's not talk about it. Yeah, they're avoiding it. Or I think there's a problem. Oh, I think both of us are responsible for it. Compromising. Or I think there's a problem. Yeah, sorry, it's my fault. Accommodating. These have times for you to go that way. But ideally, what we would like to train more and more people to do is to be able to start gravitating more towards here, to the collaborating side. I think we have a problem. Okay, let's sit together and see how we can solve this together. That's the collaborating side. Now, I'm not saying that every problem should solve like that. Sometimes it's great to say, hey, you know what? Let's not talk about this now. Let's talk about it tomorrow. It's avoiding. But it could be a fantastic way for you to handle something. But if that's your only way, then it's a problem. So we need to enrich people with the collaborative. So because that tends to be the most powerful of them all. And by knowing the collaborative well, which is the most difficult to do, then you also become better at the others. And so the idea is that we need to start getting people to train the way they handle conflict. Because at the end of the day, conflict should not be feared. It should be understood and it should be managed. And as everything that we learn to understand and manage, there needs to be some education around it. So there are a couple of concepts, just so again, on the spirit of concepts, there's conflict resolution and conflict management. What's the difference? Conflict resolution is there is a crisis, like a fire, you're trying to put it out. Conflict management is you're trying to maintain a relationship with minimum amount of conflict. And once you do, you have a mechanism to solve it easy. So just conflict resolution is an element within conflict management, just to kind of give you a sense of the field. And then when we think about conflict management, there's several things you can do to help people and organizations to do better, like training, like seeking understanding, and have more rational approach to it, so forth and so on. But what I wanted to share with you is a little bit now that there's a difference between the individual and the organizational. In the individual side, you have individual needs, but the organization might actually worry about your individual needs, but also about institutional needs. So that adds complexity. You want to fix the relationship, fine, but the organization not only want to fix your two people relationship, they also want to restore the harmony of the group. You have emotional management over here, but over here you also have reputation because other people are looking at you. Here you can have flexible solutions, but in an organization you need to have precedents and stick to a certain policy, otherwise you start creating favoritisms and problems. Here you need to build communication skills as an individual, but when it comes to the organization, you also need significantly good procedural skills to make sure that you're solving problems consistently across the board and using best practices whenever possible. And finally, instead of just going informal, you have to actually start going more formal if you're an organization. So notice how it's exponentially harder for you to actually do an institutional, organizational approach to conflict management, even though if you were to think about all of that in the individual side, is also a big journey for each individual. And we need to work on both aspects if we are to create a society that is better at peace and conflict resolution. We also can work about conflict prevention, make sure that things are not exploding. there's some operational issues you can worry about. There's some structural issues. Some things are more urgent when it happens. Some things are more long-term to prevent things from happening. So we need to work on those two dimensions. And just because everyone is talking about AI, I have a slide on AI as well. Basically, there's some research already ongoing to see, if you look over here, this is a research that came not too long ago on Nature, the Science magazine, sorry. And the idea is that they try to get a lot of people wishing different things in a particular issue. And then they would actually try to see if they could get a consensus out of it. And sometimes they would use human mediators to try to see if they could get that consensus. And then they try to use AI, LLM, Gen AI, to see if they could do the same task. And what we see here is that when AI got in, there was actually a positive correlation in actually helping the debate coalesce and people come together in consensus. So this is just to show a little bit of a hopeful message of, if AI can already do a little bit of that, in a few years, we could probably see AI being a fantastic tool to help us in our individual and group conflicts. So this is what I had for you. Sadia, thanks for waiting. I think it's time for us to have a conversation.
Thank you, Horacio. That was extremely thought-provoking. I'm sure questions are coming in, but let me start off with a few of my own. So I have a confession to make, Horacio. When I did the negotiation analysis course 30 years ago, I didn't do too well. And the feeling I left the course with was that negotiations is a zero-sum game. For me to be better off, somebody has to be worse off, and vice versa. So I'm fascinated by your writing and the discourse on the win-win situation. Has that always been the case, or has negotiation science evolved over the past 30 years?
So negotiation science took a big turn. In all fairness, I would even argue that as a science, negotiation is only about, what, 50 years old. It borrowed at some point, people started looking at game theory, psychology, and other fields, and they start picking up and realizing, you know what, this negotiation thing is not just an art. There seems to be enough science behind behaviors that influence negotiation that we can start putting them together. And that movement started on the 70s. And then in 1984, I would be remiss not to mention that, Roger Fisher, with his co-authors, William Ury and Bruce Patton, put together the book Getting to Yes, which was the first effort to try to codify a bit more what negotiations were, what principles you could find, what best practices you'll be looking at. And that book, I think, was a transformative piece of work and piece of research, because it really showed that there is an element of art in negotiation, but there's also science. And then they even took it one step further and say, and it's not just about win-lose, you can also do win-win. Since then, though, there's been waves going back and forth. Sometimes win-win gets a little bit more popular. Sometimes people get more popular on the win-lose. So now, for example, we've seen The Art of the Deal from Trump. We see the bestseller, I think, in Amazon right now for negotiations, Never Split the Difference, which is a book also kind of heavily on the win-lose. Not saying they're bad books, I'm just saying they're heavily on the win-lose. And so at some point, it also becomes a strategic choice. Negotiation can be win-lose. Negotiation can be win-win, depending on which strategies you believe will be best.
Great, thank you. Now, given what's happening around the world, talk of tariffs, trade wars, protectionism, barriers to entry, unless, of course, you happen to have $5 million to enter the US. Tell me, these are the core values, very much against the core values that INSEAD has stood for the past 6 decades. In the new world order, if that is emerging, is our thought process going to become outdated?
No, I don't think our thought process is outdated, because I think there's enough science behind what INSEAD has been teaching. We're not preaching, we're not politicizing, we're literally going back to science and saying, this is what the science shows it works. Now, science can evolve, and we here at INSEAD try to push that boundary, and we try to follow what our colleagues are doing in other places. But we try very hard to, while remaining kind of somewhat biased on the globalization exercise, because we do believe on one planet, we do believe that we need to build bridges, we do believe that by working together we can do better. Science does come as the primary element there. And so when we see all of these things that you mentioned, the barriers, the tariffs, and all of that, I find it very much so, and again, of course, I'm very biased, I'm a negotiation professor, I see it a lot of that as just part of what I just mentioned about conflict management. People are not talking as much. People are starting to become more individualist. National polities are trying to make people feel that they're more loyal by speaking against other countries because it's easy to look good to your in-group if you speak bad about your out-group. So there are some of these things are getting more mediatic, more social media and things of sorts. We're consuming news now in 1 or 2 sentences. So of course you cannot have deep thoughts and discourses. But to the more recent tariff threats and moves in the last couple of months, a lot of it, I see it as a negotiation tactic. It's a very consistent tactic with a win-lose approach. I issue a threat, you get scared, you come to me, I get an advantage out of it. Now, not everyone can pull that off. Someone to pull that off has to have a lot of power, which, for example, the US happens to have. And so the US can do that. And I think part of the reason why is that, and this is me taking a risk a bit here, is that the US feels a little bit resentful of taking the leadership of the world burden on its back, financing a lot of, or majorly financing a lot of multilateral institutions, but not getting any advantage or even much recognition anymore as they used to get in the past from these efforts. So I think that what the US is trying to do now is a reset. Okay, you want to get all the good stuff we do, don't assume it's going to happen. You need to convince us again that we should step in and do it. So by doing this resetting is almost like doing a zero budgeting in a company. But it's just that the way that it's being done seems very aggressive. So that's one interpretation. I'm sure there are thousands of others.
Sure. That leads on to the next question, of course. Everybody's focused on what's going to be happening in Washington today. Is it always important to start negotiations from a position of strength? Does one have to seek $350 billion in return to be offered a minerals deal in return? Or is this playing by an old playbook, or is this writing a new chapter in negotiation analysis?
So it's definitely not a new chapter. It's a old playbook, coming in with a position of strength, saying, hey, you need me, I don't need you, and if you want me to come to the table, you need to give me something, has been happening for centuries, millennia, I would even argue. So the idea of negotiation as a ritualized battle is not new. And in the battle, trying to show strength is, of course, one of the ways to try to intimidate the counterparty, which sometimes might even yield without fighting. You see that in the animal world all the time. Males fighting for territory, they will kind of pound their chest, they will do displays of power so that they intimidate the other, so that they don't have to engage in the cost of fighting. And that is, of course, then actually a smart thing to do if you're going to be playing just a power game. Now, it's not rewriting because of that, but also you said, is it something that we have to do? No, absolutely not. Actually, even if you're facing someone who is displaying that strategy, you don't have to come and try to prove that you are in a position of power. Because one, sometimes you're not, and two, sometimes you might have overestimated how much power you have. And so there are a lot of risks in doing that, and very few people are in such a position that there's extreme clarity that they actually have power. But here's the other catch. You don't need only power. You need to have more power than the other. Because if I'm really big, maybe you have a gun. And so I need to be very careful before putting power in my negotiations, because there's a lot of uncertainty nowadays when it comes to power. Again, with a few exceptions. And so Trump is, for example, working a lot of his power in his negotiation, and that kind of makes some logical sense from a theoretical perspective. Again, I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's strategically consistent with a lot of the other stuff he's doing, which is the power game, the win-lose game. So at least in that game, he's kind of doing a lot of what people would recommend one would do. Now, is that the better game? I don't think it is. Is that the right game? Who am I to tell? I'm not in his shoes. The future will tell. Yeah. Now, is he running some risks, and is he likely to be facing some resistance soon? That's what the theory will say. The theory will say that when you apply win-lose tactics, you should be expecting resistance in forms that you might not anticipate, and you don't know when they might happen. They might happen soon, they might happen later, but that's what the theory would be advising, or at least alerting or anticipating for anyone who's applying win-lose tactics or trying to start already from a position of power.
Interesting times indeed. Just before we take the question from the participants, moving very quickly to the other elephant in the room, Gaza, cherished homeland for many, real estate dreamland for some. Is starting with such polarized views about the same piece of land a good starting point with negotiations, or is it, no pun intended, eliminating the space for negotiations to actually take place?
So So it could be eliminating in the sense that if people are taking the positions that I mentioned a few minutes back of your idea is from your group is stupid, therefore we shouldn't even talk about it, then of course coming up with an extreme idea or very novel or different idea that seems to go against the values of some or many will actually give people the excuse to say, you see, this is so extreme, we shouldn't even talk to them. There's not even room for a deal here. But I do find that a little sad because the whole point of when we teach about brainstorming or when I mention about the brave space is the idea that we should come together and not really be afraid of ideas. We should be afraid of actions, but at least when we're trying to have ideas to help solve problems. Of course, ideas can be dangerous, but what I'm saying is when we're in a room together, trying to find solutions together, we should not be afraid of ideas in the sense of, I'm just putting it on the table so that we can discuss it. Because sometimes an idea that starts bad, with some tweaking becomes acceptable, and more tweaking becomes good. Or maybe it triggers some other thinking because it opens a new variable that people have been blind to, and therefore that will be good. For example, the international relations field, when it talks about countries at war risk, they usually have two main strategies, appeasement and brinkmanship. Like, can we not come up with better strategies than there's just these two? Can we not be a bit more creative? So while I'm not saying that the idea per se is good or bad, because that's not for me to say, I'm not part of that conflict directly. Of course, everyone is indirectly affected, but not directly. I think that the idea is that we should be welcoming new ideas in a protected space where we can understand that we're just ventilating ideas to create as much creativity so that we can leverage our resources, our values, and our people in the safest way into the future. I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope it does.
That does, Horacio. So I'm going to quickly jump because I can see our Q&A flooding with fascinating questions. Let's take the first one from Robin Barron. How does the dissolution of community groups, i.e. religion, and our institutions accelerate the trends towards increased conflict?
Okay, so I don't have data on the acceleration of trends of those particular community or religious groups. So I apologize if I'm just going to share from my understanding of the other data that I've seen and the theories that I look into. And so there are a couple of things. The challenge of religion sometimes is that it can create extremism. It can create the perception that you are right, that you are holy, and the other one is not. So to some extent, one of the reasons why we actually seen more recently less conflict than 200 years ago, 500 years ago, some argue that it has a little bit to do with the softening of religion in the West, right? Or maybe even of some more radical views in the East as well. And so because then we take a more humanist approach and we start recognizing the other, even if they're different, as someone worthy of respect and being treated in a similar way. The growth of human rights and the likes with that. That's one side, the negative side of those groups. Of course, these groups also have a positive side. Religious groups and many other such community groups, they are groups that aggregate, that support, that help, that make people interact in communities and learn how to interact with others. So when there's that diversity within the community, and that helps people learn how to tolerate differences, how to engage in conflict, how to grow together, how to appreciate differences, then these communities are extremely powerful to educate us as people for a bigger world. And so what I'm trying to say is that some communities could, depending if they take too radical a view, be negative, but in general, I see more of that community life as a school for us to grow as human beings in a collective. And so if there is a deterioration of that in many countries, and I tend to think, and again, this is my own individual thought, not as an academic, I tend to think that that might be happening, but it could be my own availability bias as well, that I would see as a negative trend as well.
Thank you, Horacio. We have a question from Nias K. How can we move from safe space to brave space?
Okay, not easy. Thanks for asking. Yes, I know. I'm sorry, I just touched upon it. I would recommend you read the book then from my friend Dan Shapiro, Negotiated Non-Negotiable. He actually talks about it in more detail than I will be able to cover here. The idea is to acknowledge, actually one of the things is you can start with a safe space and then gradually move towards a brave space. Because the moment people feel a certain sense of psychological safety with you, you can start bringing up a few more audacious ideas, like the brave space. And so if you already have the safe space, just bringing the ideas and having people discuss about it, if it will work for that group or not. What can we do if someone crosses the line, anticipating the failures or the extremes of the brave space, and then creating mechanisms, procedures, so that if those happen, we can quickly fix them, will make people feel still psychologically safe when they go into the brave space. Remember, it's a little bit that difference that I mentioned before between the individual and the organizational conflict management. You do have to be a little bit more procedurally focused to make sure that you're creating boundaries and mechanisms to protect people in the brave space still. The goal is still to have psychological safety. The difference is that you're now having psychological safety, but with a higher openness for people to addressing the elephant in the room, the truth, and really dealing with the freedom of speech that is necessary for ideas to emerge, problems to emerge, so that we can solve them.
Great. Question from Daniel Barcele. How to deal with people that don't want to be in this frame of mind of win-win that you propose, but see the world as winner take it all?
Yes, that's a difficult one. I'll take a sip of water to help myself there. Meaning, first remember that many times we're going to see others that way, but they're not that way. They're doing that way because they might be anticipating that that's how you have to deal with things. Notice, the question, if I heard correctly, Sadia, was if the other person is. Well, do you really know if the person is that way or if they're just behaving that way? And I like to give this example sometimes in class where, for example, you probably in high school or college, you had a friend and you had another friend and you were friends to both, but they couldn't tolerate one another. Wait a minute, if they don't tolerate one another, they probably think the other person is bad. But how can you be friends to both of them? That means that there's a good side of them. And so that brings back the duality nature that I mentioned before between Hobbes and Rousseau, the idea that what I try to do when I see a person like that is I try to think the following. That person is behaving like that. That person isn't that. And they're behaving like that because some of their morals, some of their thinking, some of their view of the world, some of their context or individual choices are pushing them in that direction. If I can understand what is motivating that behavior, not the being, the behavior, and I can now address some of the concerns of that behavior, my experience, because I've been in that situation many times, is that most people will eventually start entertaining behaving differently because they're seeing that you're helping them move away from a behavior that, remember, most people repudiate violence. Most people don't like to be a bully or violent. Sometimes they feel like they have to if they feel threatened or if you're from the out group. But if you start building bridges and relationships and you start showing that there's no fear, no reason to fear you, you will see a lot of people changing their behaviors.
Recipe for an ideal world, Horacio. Thank you.
Well, we have to rebuild every day, but yes.
Absolutely. A question from Anif. How to negotiate then with a personality like Trump, Putin, Orban, Kim Jong-un, etc.?
Okay. I am actually co-writing with my good friend as well, Rodrigo Gouveia, an article on how to negotiate with Trump, etc., etc., etc. And it should be coming out in a couple of weeks. So keep tuned on LinkedIn, at INSEAD, and others for it when it comes out.
Great. Moving on to a question from Elena Tarasevich. Do you believe that there are cultures or nations that are somehow naturally better in the win-win negotiations? If so, which ones?
I don't think so. I literally don't. I do think that in some countries, the educational system leans people a bit more to collaboration and others less, meaning, but it's not that people don't have the potential. So I am not really, again, I go back to the dualistic nature. I really believe that people have the potential to do good or evil, depending on how you help or not them. I do accept that there's a 1%, 2% of Machiavellian psychopaths, sociopaths in the world. So but they are very few. We need to be more focusing on the majority. Because if the majority starts agreeing with you and doing something positive, the 1% or 2% eventually will have to fit in, eventually will have to be taken with the wave. And so that's how I see the idea of working that. But I don't think that a particular country is naturally, because their culture is more maybe the education, or maybe they feel safer, they have stronger economy. so they don't have to fight for survival every day, like in some other countries, where then that fight for survival perception it becomes a rationalization for people to do more violent moves. Remember, if people feel threatened, if their life or survival feels threatened, and so in some countries where there seems to be more scarce resource scarcity, maybe people will behave a bit more win-lose. But the moment you put them in a different country, or the moment you make their situation a little bit better, or the moment they're negotiating with family members or others, you see a complete transformation. So again, I see a few variables here and there. We could start looking at, oh, but there is a trend more in one country than the other. But I think that is so fickle and so reliable on different variables that I wouldn't say one country is better than the other on any element of negotiation.
Indeed, I think there's a lot of contextualizing in negotiation analysis specific to the people or the nations that are involved. Question from Bart Shepper: which recommendation do you have for the European leaders with regards to playing a role in managing the Ukraine conflict?
Ooh, all right. You guys are not taking easy on me, huh? Thank you. So no, this is good, and that's why we're here. And I appreciate you actually making this a brave space and asking the difficult questions as well, because those are the important questions. So I think that what happened, unfortunately, in the last couple of months is that Europe and the U.S., which are supposed to be in a way on the same side, now they're not. People are not understanding more how the alliance is working. So there's a lot of internal conflict within a certain side, and there's not a lot of dialogue, unfortunately, for several factors, which is not helping people then have let's call it now again, just to ride the wave, the brave space, to come up with new ideas. And how could we even reinvent ourselves as an alliance to have that conversation? But on the other side, there's also, I hope, that Europe could do an appreciation of, as much as Europe might say the horrible things about Putin, and I don't know the guy, and I'm not for or against because it's not for me to be, we have to be careful with the demonization I showed before, the little angel and the demon. To say that we're all on one side perfect and the other one is wrong completely, well, is usually oversimplifying things. And I actually, when the whole, and again, I'm the first one to say that Russia invaded Ukraine. I'm not saying that it's both their faults. I'm not saying that. But what I'm trying to say is, if we don't understand the other side, and if we completely demonize and avoid conversations, then chances are the war will just continue. And with all the lives that are dying, with all the destruction that is happening, with all the cost to the small people who literally had nothing to do with this conflict. And when I say small people, I'm one of them. Meaning I'm not a president of a nation who decides to go to war or not. I appreciate that people are trying to defend something when they feel invaded, and they should. I appreciate that some people feel threatened, they might actually try to preempt. And so the problem is that there's fear going everywhere. There's miscommunication or lack of communication going everywhere. So again, I'm not trying to take a political side here. I do not support any of the sides when I'm standing here as a professor of conflict management or negotiation. What I'm trying to do is to say, from a negotiation conflict management perspective, both sides are making such poor moves. And when I say both sides, I say Russia, US, China, Ukraine, Europe, just about everyone. No one is really actually helping the conversation move towards peace. And so I haven't seen much in that space. If anything, if my sources are correct, which nowadays is sometimes hard to tell, 2 to 3 months later, there was a deal offered, and it seems like the US and the UK said, no, we're not ready to have peace yet. I never understood what that meant. At some point, I just stopped kind of taking a look into it. But I just think that everyone could be doing a bit better. If you take nothing from what I'm saying, that's what I'm saying.
Thank you. I think we have time just for 2 more questions. A quick one, how to deal with quote-unquote unreasonable actors in negotiations, from Chris Malouf. Do you want to add to what you've already said earlier to that?
So how to deal with unreasonable actors? Well, what I like to say when people say, oh, that person is unreasonable, is I like to reframe that as that person doesn't have my reason.
Okay.
Because in their minds, they have a reason. The moment you start to think that the person is unreasonable, you're basically saying they're crazy or stupid. And most people don't get to a level to talk to you being unreasonable. They would either be in a mental health institution, or they would have died already. Because unreasonable people kill themselves, drink poison, do stupid things, cross on the green light. You know, like, that's what unreasonable people do. They don't have a sense of reality. So if you see someone and your first instinct is to think that they are unreasonable, I would invite you to rephrase that as different reason than mine. And therefore, what is my task now as a negotiator? Let me go find what reason that is, because the moment I understand their reason, I can influence them. But if I don't understand their reason and I just say they're unreasonable, I'm actually giving them power because I just convinced myself I cannot change their mind, so I have to change mine. And so that means I have to give in. So the word unreasonable actually works against us as much as it works against the other person.
Indeed, important life lessons, Horacio. I'm going to take one more, and this is the longest, but I think it's important.
All right.
From Tarun Sankaran. When it comes to global conflicts, the mechanism set up to manage conflict between nations is slowly being dismantled, with large countries walking away from multilateral institutions, UN, WHO. How can we even think about peace and conflict management at a global level without having the underlying mechanisms available for their resolution?
Okay, so let me first say I do agree. I actually think that that's a little bit of a stepping backwards exercise, in the sense that those multilateral institutions do amazing work day in, day out, in a very silent way, invisible to most people, to help us have a more peaceful world. We do still have some conflicts here and there, but the science and the practice is that if these were not around, we would probably be seeing significantly more. It's like closing down embassies and not talking to the other side. How can you actually negotiate peace if you're not doing that? So very much agreed with those. So what I think is happening, though, is that some of these organizations feel that these institutions, these multilateral institutions, they became too rigid, they became corrupted, they became inefficient, and therefore they feel like they're not getting what they need to get through them, and they're leaving. Much like when an CEO were to come to an organization and say, let's do a complete change. But because in a company you can actually do a massive organizational change, in these multilateral institutions, given the power distribution, it's much harder for you to actually promote that kind of change, because there's going to be a lot more resistance to that change. So I think that some people are trying to vote with their feet as they walk out, hoping that that will trigger changes so that they can come back. Or maybe it's just a tactic to get more of a pie, a slice of the pie. That's also possible. But I do, at least if you try to understand the other person from their dual nature, you hold both of those assumptions. They're doing it because they want to improve it, but they feel like they're not being able to do it from the inside, or they might be trying to get a bigger piece of the pie. Believe in both. Don't believe in only one. Until you actually know from them what true is, believe in both and see, wait a minute, if we do improve it, would they come back? If they come back, then you know they were doing it from an altruistic reason. If they don't, well, at the very least, you already improved it anyhow. And if they wanted a bigger pie, now they're not going to have it because now it's improved. And so either way, the best outcome is to believe in all of the different possibilities and just pursue the one that will yield the more positive result. And hopefully that will help you engage the other side. Because I do believe that we need those multilateral institutions, and many more actually, not bureaucracies, not slow-moving things, but efficient things that are making moves in the ground, that are changing lives and improving lives and making our world a more peaceful place for us to live.
Thank you, Horacio. I think that's all we have time for. I believe you do want to share a few slides on the new initiative, but I really want to thank you for these thought-provoking answers, and to the audience, of course, for their questions and making this so interactive. Over to you, Horacio.
Sadia, thank you so much. So I just want to let people know that we created at INSEAD the Negotiation and Conflict Management Collaborative, NCMC for short. Please do click on this QR code or take a copy of it for later for you to see what we're doing. We're really trying to expand the understanding and the knowledge of negotiation and conflict management around the world. And we would love to collaborate with anyone who is looking for more. We'll love to help you learn more. We'll love to help you get more. If for whatever reason you're already a professional in the field and you would like to teach negotiation or conflict management from a win-win perspective, we have here the Negotiation Course for the World package, which you can download entirely for free with a one-button click. We have it in English. We already have it in Arabic. Our ambition is to make it into 100 different languages. So if you would like to use the materials, you're welcome to do it. If you would like to help us translate more and prepare materials so that others will use it, we're also open to that, of course. And if you would like to add materials to help us expand the library, of course, we're also open. It's all free, Creative Commons use. Just also want to tell you about a new series that is coming up, is Between the Lines with NCMC. We changed the name now, sorry. And we're going to be having some fantastic speakers in the first and second semester. We have Chris Blackman, who talks about why we fight, the origin, what are the real reasons why people go into conflict and war. Charles Kupchan, that talks about how enemies become friends, how do people and country can actually get together even when they were enemies. Mary Gentil, that talks about ethics from a negotiation perspective. Hervé and Rodrigo, who are actually my co-authors for full disclosure, in a book on how to negotiate and improve healthcare across the world. Dr. Joshua Weiss, who will talk about how to come back from impasse. He just wrote a fantastic book on that topic as well. So when you have an impasse, how do you improve? And finally, Adam Cahan, who will talk to us about how to collaborate even with enemies, even when you see each other as enemies. So finally, I just want to share as well that I just published an article at the Harvard Business Review magazine with my friend Thomas Wigelman on the secret of cross-cultural negotiations. And given that we touched upon that briefly, here's a link to the article for you. I will now then close that window and see if there are any closing elements.
I think we're done, Horacio. I think a big shout out to the INSEAD Lifelong Learning team for putting this together and many more webinars. And for those of you starting the month of fasting tomorrow, Ramadan Mubarak.
Ramadan Mubarak. Yes, thank you. And if you have any questions, follow-ups, or others, do feel free to email or contact me. I'll be glad to follow up, as I just said, through the NCMC or personally. Sadia, a real pleasure working with you. I was so looking forward to this. Thanks for making this a great event.
Likewise.
And for the LLL team, thank you very much. Looking forward to the next one.